It's great to welcome you back to part two as we talk about POPIA and how you become compliant. And a great pleasure to have from Microsoft Catherine De Klerk, who's the modern work specialist at Microsoft. Great to have you with us. And attorneys at Michalsons, John Giles and Mark Heyink, a warm welcome to all of you. And thank you for joining me once again for this very, very important discussion about POPIA. Remind me, John, how long do we have? What are those timelines again? I think we need to keep reminding people because I think people are at the back of the mind saying, oh, I've still got a bit of time, but remind us of those timelines.
Yes, we're about in the middle of a 1-year grace period, and that ends on 30 June 2021. So the deadline is 1 July 2021.
Okay. And there's no ways that is going to be extended. We need to remind people that because the president has hit the green button, and you've got until the 1st of July to comply. Well, let me first ask you and start off by asking you, Catherine, and you've got some great demos right now to show us in this particular presentation. Is data protection not a business issue at the end of the day? I mean, a lot of people saying, well, it's a business issue, we can sort it out. What would Microsoft's role be in this topic, and what tools do you guys help to, help customers become compliant? Catherine, let's start with you.
Okay, thanks, Aki. So definitely, I mean, it is, after all, is a business issue, but a lot of times in the business, there needs to be a way to facilitate how an organization actually gets to their data. So when we look at data, you have to know what data you have. You have to be able to protect that data, and you need to be able to govern it. And to be able to do those things is quite cumbersome for most organizations, because to find your data, that takes a long time, and you need to classify that data. And to do that manually takes an awful lot of time for customers. And by the time they've done that, that information is already stale. So what we've done as Microsoft, we said, okay, giving them tools to help them discover where their data is sitting, give them tools to be able to classify that data automatically based on certain sensitive information inside the documentations, and then help them govern that data. So look at things like retention policies, how to find data if there's any kind of a case. And at the end of the day, those are the components that we've built into the solution. We've also got something called Compliance Manager that helps you look at what data you have and apply an assessment against that data against POPIA. So those are just some of the things that we've done as Microsoft to help our customers in this regard.
I mean, when you talk about Compliance Manager, is it a module that sits on your network that scans the network? And can you tell us how it actually works? Is it something that you download? You obviously buy it as a separate module, but does it just sit on the network and go through all of your data?
So we've got a lot of customers that are Office 365 customers today. And because
Yes.
the information sitting in things like email, sitting in things like SharePoint, sitting in different places where they store their data, what we're able to do with Compliance Manager is find where all those data sources are. They don't always have to be in Office 365, and then apply assessment against that data and see, okay, based on POPIA's controls and the mappings against that, where are the areas of improvement that an organization needs to take? So what are the remediation actions that they have to take? So that tool basically runs on the file shares, the different places where data is stored, and then provides them an assessment and shows them based on that what their score is and what are those areas that they need to improve on.
Okay, fantastic. And Mark, I mean, you in one of our previous interviews, you've mentioned this often, and I think it's important to highlight it again, that this is a business issue, not a compliance issue.
Yes, Aki, I think that, I mean, any modern business, most of our information is in electronic form, and therefore we need to use the tools that help us deal with that information. I think another thing that is very important in looking at this is that we've just had an explosion of information that we process in the normal course of our business. So nobody would ever have argued that systems that we had around paper, whether it was retention, keeping it in a storeroom or whatever the case might be, was not part of the business. And using the tools that Microsoft have provided is one of the mechanisms that you can use to ensure that your information is governed, so that you know what you've got to do, so that you can comply with regulation where necessary. But more importantly, just to make sure that you're doing your business well, that you have efficient mechanisms of sourcing and sorting out the information that you need to run your business well. So I think what Catherine has said, I echo what she said, but that to me is the rationale, that this is a business issue and we should be looking at the tools that best help us to do business.
Okay, it makes perfect sense. So, I mean, how does one know how does a customer know what data they have and what decision they make to protect this particular data? Now, I know that you've got a fantastic demo with us, so I'm going to shoot that question over to you, Catherine, so that you can put that on our screens, because I think this is a very useful tool on determining what kind of data you actually have as a customer.
Absolutely. So let me share my screen with everybody. So as a starting point, I mean, initially I spoke around data classification and around, what is sensitive data. So first of all, built inside our tools, like things like Word and Excel and Outlook, you have the sensitivity label here that shows you, is this document, is it a public type document, is it general, is it confidential, highly confidential, and you can go and classify this depending on the nature of that document. So this is one way you can do it. So as an example, you can see confidential. It would be Microsoft full-term employee, fixed-term employee that would be able to access this document. If I had to send it on to somebody else that wasn't a Microsoft employee, they wouldn't be able to open the document. But that's very much an annual process right now. So even if you look in things like Excel, we've got the same capability there. We've also got this built into Outlook. So if I've got my Outlook, I've been able to classify an email as well, depending on the sensitivity of that email. But ultimately, what makes it a lot easier for customers is if in that document you've got something of a sensitive nature, so maybe it's a South African ID number or it's account number, whatever that sensitive data type is, that's what actually should drive the actual classification. So if I'm, as an organization, putting the onus on the end user to classify, that puts a lot of thinking on the end of the end user to do that. And what we want to do is take that away and actually automate the process. So as an example, I've got a document here, and if I put in the word confidential as an example, what it will do is pick up that I've used the specific specific sensitive data type, and in this case, the word is confidential, and it automatically actually document and restricts access. And it puts a watermark across the actual page. Now, why that's so important is that this way, anytime any kind of sensitive data is being used in the organization, I actually safeguard my employees from actually letting that information fall outside the realms of the organization, because I've put these measures in place. And that's part of what the tool does for you. Take that thinking away from the end user and provide that automation so they don't have to worry about using documents or sending information that potentially has got personal information in it. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's very cool. So every single document is basically classified. Is there a setting that one could use that forces a user to classify the document every time they use it, for example? Because sometimes we forget to classify it. So does it do it by default? I know you've mentioned if you write in confidential, it automatically picks it up with the AI. But
yes.
You obviously have to classify every single document.
So, as an example, if I've got specific documents within Microsoft that are, perhaps it's our, roadmap and it's considered as NDA, if I'm going to save that document, it will actually prompt me to classify it. So there's measures and policies that are put in place. If the data in that document is considered, maybe it's not necessarily a keyword, but of the nature of the document, it's got some roadmap details in it, I would be prompted to classify it. So those are policies that you can build. I mean, if you see out the box here, you've got some that already come inside of the data classification, but you can add your own. So not every single one in here may not be pertinent to you, but what we've tried to do is put a whole lot. You've got about 152 that we get out the box, but there might be specific things to an organization that aren't necessarily going to fall in the realm of, a credit card number or an account number or so forth. You can actually create your own data types, and it's all built by policy and driving that across the organization.
So, John, these tools are very cool. It must make your jobs as attorneys a lot easier to help along with the compliance journey. I think this is an amazing tool.
Yes, definitely, because there are multiple data laws that create regulatory requirements or controls for different kinds of data. And so if you don't know what kinds of data you've got and you haven't classified it, it's very hard then to comply with the relevant law. And maybe to give you some examples is that in POPIA, there's one kind of data is an account number. And we've spoken about how that's a particularly sensitive or high-risk piece of data, because if you fail to protect it, it's a 10 million rand fine or potentially a 10-year jail term. And so it's very important to protect account numbers. And so you need to know when you're processing account numbers, where those sit in your systems. Are they in emails? Where are those account numbers? So it's very important to know your data, and then you can start complying with the different laws. A few other examples maybe is one is children's data. There are different legal requirements around that, and special personal data as well. There's specific regulatory requirements around those kind of data, and unless you know where that kind of data is and you've classified it, it becomes very hard to comply with the law.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. I mean, Catherine, when you look at the tools that you've just talked about, I mean, what kind of tools does Microsoft offer to help, for example, organizations to assess what action to take, for example, in response to different data laws that John just mentioned?
So what we have actually built is something called Compliance Manager. So I'm just going to open up that window for you. The Compliance Manager basically looks at different regulations. So in our case, POPIA, but you could be an organization that is globally distributed. So you might have dealings in Europe, as an example. So their GDPR would play a part. You might have a specific industry, such as health, and there might be certain regulations that you need to abide by. So in essence, what we do is we have this tool called Compliance Manager that we run assessments against the data that you have, and then provide you input and say to you, these are the areas that you need to remediate. These are the controls that need to be put in place. And then we give you the guiding principles on how you need to go and implement that. So you can see, as an example, I've been giving a score of how I'm complying against certain regulations. And I'm then able to look and see, okay, against which regulations am I actually being assessed against? And if I go against assessments here, you'll see I've got POPIA, I've got a data protection baseline, and I've got GDPR. So it's gone and assessed everything against those specific controls within that regulation, and it's showing me what areas I need to make improvements on.
Okay, and I would imagine that's very useful for a multinational, for example, that has, jurisdictions in other areas where you can actually assess where you stand with other laws around the world. Now, John, we often hear about gap analysis. Can you just touch on gap analysis and how this works in relation to Compliance Manager?
Yes, sure. So a gap analysis is essentially comparing your organization or an aspect of it, so for example, your data, you're comparing that to a regulatory requirement or a law, rule, code, or standard, and you're then looking for gaps and then wanting to determine what action to take based on those gaps that you've identified. And that's exactly what the Compliance Manager is enabling you to do with an assessment. You're able to assess how much or to what extent your organization complies with a particular regulatory requirement or control.
Okay. I mean, Catherine, and I was just touching just earlier on the different regulations, and I see that on that demonstration you've got other jurisdictions, and clearly Compliance Manager doesn't only offer this for POPIA. You don't have that one template just for POPIA, because I'm sure there must be other templates that are built in and that you could even add for customers to use, right?
Absolutely. So I've just clicked on add an assessment. I've got those three listed: GDPR, POPIA, and data protection baseline. But if I click there, you'll see there's a whole list of other ones. So another one that customers are looking at is NIST. Another one is ISO 27001. And there's a whole bunch of different regulations that one can actually add and assess their data against. So it's not just those ones that I've highlighted. Given that Microsoft is a global organization, we look at across all the different customers that we have in the different locations and apply different assessments based on their regulation requirements that they have.
Okay. Let me ask Mark quickly, when you look at those different jurisdictions, I mean, our POPIA compliance doesn't differ massively from the rest of the world, right? It's the laws are very similar, aren't they, on how we protect data?
Absolutely, Aki. The point is that in the drafting of POPIA, a lot of attention was paid to other data protection laws around the world. So certainly insofar as the principles that govern data processing are concerned, there's a very, very strong overlap. There are not many differences. There are definitely differences in administrative provisions, etc., but the principles are pretty standard throughout the world. What we have also seen is the General Data Protection Regulation is now the gold standard, and we match up pretty well to that standard. There's not a lot of work that we would have to do in addition to what we do for POPI to actually comply with GDPR as well. Yes, there are developments that have got to be built in, and that's one of the things that one's got to look at.
Okay. Now, Catherine, if you can go back to that previous slide where you had the graph, I think it showed 69%, if I'm not mistaken. So I see that after you run the POPIA assessment, you get a bunch of graphs as you've got on your screen right now, and there's different controls in what I can see over there. So that's a compliance score. It's 69%. What exactly does that mean?
So if I go down to, firstly, it shows you areas that you need to have implement in order to make sure that you are more compliant. So if I go to an assessment, so before I go into it, I just want to show you something. You'll see that there's a column here that says your improvement actions and Microsoft actions. So the way Microsoft uses it, it's a shared responsibility model. We understand that as an organization, if we provide a service to our customers, we also need to make sure we comply to regulation. So there's components to the service that we will then make sure that we comply with. And then we'll show you within an assessment, what are the things that you as an organization need to comply with. So if you look down here, you'll see improvement actions as an example. And there's a list of different actions that you as an organization need to put in place. So as an example, you've got your adhere to retention periods. And just incidentally, just so that you can see, when we do something like this, you'll see that it doesn't just meet POPIA standards, but it meets GDPR. So when I implement an improvement action like this one, I'm not just meeting one regulation, but two. So I don't have to go and do it twice. If I implement it here, it will tick it off on both regulations. So I'm actually then increasing my score on both assessments. And then if I go into the actual improvement action, what it will do is actually give me the details. It will show to me how to implement it, what I need to do. I'm then able to actually upload documents to this if I want to. I can edit, any implementation notes and say, okay, well, this is the actions that I took. And then what I'm also able to do, because with this type of regulation, it's not just one person doing all this work. There's a lot of people that need to be involved in the organization. So if I clicked on something like the edit status, I could assign this, to, somebody in my organization. I'm just trying to think who's available here, but I could assign it to somebody called Alex Wilbur and give them a status and give them an implementation date as to when they need to actually make sure that they put this in place on their side. And once I've implemented it, then you'll see that then it has a scoring. So you'll see that there's points that I can achieve. And once I've implemented it and done the necessary, steps to order to do that, I will then go back to my compliance manager and my score would have then improved. And that's really, it's basically going through all the different implementation of the different steps that I need to take, and then making sure that then feeds into my score, because it then proves that I've actually implemented that.
Okay. John, what exactly is a control, and how do you implement these controls?
Yeah, a control is essentially a regulatory requirement, and it really is remarkable. What Microsoft has done is truly remarkable. They've gone and found a long list of data laws, codes, rules, and standards, and identified what the controls are under each law. They've also then done an exercise to compare where those controls exist across multiple laws. And so what you're able to do is, through an assessment and by looking at a control, you can look at a control that features in multiple laws. And so many organizations these days are multinationals. They're in many jurisdictions and have to comply with a multitude of laws, rules, codes, and standards. And so this is a very helpful way to enable them to do one assessment and meet the controls or regulatory requirements in many different jurisdictions.
Okay. And you know, John, I'm just looking at this process. I mean, this is quite a process. This is not something that you can do a month before and start this on the 1st of June 2021. You know, what much time should companies be dedicating to this? And I imagine that the bigger the company, the more you know, the more things you've got to do and the more time you need. But is there a you know, is there a time that you have that you'll say you'll need 6 months to do this based on the size of your company? Because this is not something you can do in 4 weeks.
Yes. Yeah, Aki, I totally agree with you. It depends on the size of the organization, but also more importantly, what the impact is on that organization. So for example, if you're a small business, that processes a little bit of personal data, but it's not your core business, you could probably do it in a couple of months. But as soon as you process lots of personal data and the larger the organization becomes, it really is an extensive exercise. And it's going to take most large organizations at least 6 months. And so it's actually already too late.
Okay, no, that's interesting. Thank you for saying that, because I was trying to work out. I mean, this is. I mean, compliance manager is fantastic, but you really need to put in the effort to make it actually work. Now, Catherine, how does compliance manager allow you to create and track these actions? I saw you've got lots of audit reports that you're able to access. Tell me how this all works with those audit reports.
Sure. So as you saw in the improvement actions, and once I've actually done an improvement action, if I put some notes in there and I've uploaded documents, all of those, every single step that I take when I assign it to somebody, so if I upload a document or if I add implementation notes or any kind of test notes or any other notes, I then actually, all of those are recorded inside Compliance Manager. And
Right.
what I'm able then to do is generate a report. So I'll click on Generate Reports. Will actually then provide me an Excel spreadsheet, which then goes and looks at every single one of those remediation actions and controls that I need to implement. And will actually show me what my status is. So that while I was opening up the Excel spreadsheet here, it will actually tell me against each and every single one of those actions, what my score is, have I achieved it, you know, what the actual related control is to that. And this is something that I can actually manage and actually send to my auditor. So you'll see I have 2 sheets here. I've got a customer manage, so those are the remediation actions that I need to take as an organization. And then you'll see the Microsoft managed ones, the ones that we as Microsoft have made sure that we've implemented to make sure that our service is compliant. And that's something that makes it a lot easier. Instead of a manual process of recording this, all those actions are recorded, and then you can hand it off to an auditor to review.
Okay. I mean, Mark, do you want to touch on that documentary proof? Is this adequate as in terms of audit reports?
Aki, obviously evidence is always important when you're dealing with demonstrating that you've done something properly and in compliance with the law. And the better your documentary evidence, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to show that and possibly even avoid having to face any consequences or tribunals around what you might have done or not done. So it is very important. And I think that one of the very important things about this is this information, this evidence is not static. This is not something that you do once as an event. So as an example, you might be compliant today. You might have done everything you can, etc., and you're satisfied that you are processing lawfully. And then suddenly you don't do something well. You don't do a patch, for instance, from a technical perspective, and that it creates a vulnerability. You would then have to show what you have done to deal with that new risk that has come about. And this is an important information security and also data protection. And that is that this is an ongoing and continuous procedure. And it's quite difficult to do this on a static paper-based type of background where you're keeping evidence that way. What the tool allows you to do, of course, is to have very up-to-date evidence of what you've done and be able to look historically at what you might have done in the past if there is a breach that might have been the source of which might have been at some time in the past. So it is very, very important and an important tool for all organizations. Just remember, in terms of data protection laws generally, you are required to document your activities, document the controls that you have in place, etc. That's an important aspect of what we're dealing with.
Yeah, it's so interesting as you're all talking about this. I mean, this is a new mindset for every organization, because this is now baked into your DNA. You know, you don't just stop doing this on the 1st of July next year. This is ongoing. You've got to keep doing it. It's now, you know, it's baked into the processes of your organization. And John, I mean, what is the relationship between POPIA and information governance? And I want to ask this question to John, Mark, and Catherine.
Yes, sure. And, you know, data protection and POPIA is really a component of information governance. Information governance is a much bigger topic. Right. And many people talk about governance, risk, and compliance. And very much data protection falls within that context. And without governing your data well, it's very hard to protect it. And so they're very closely related. Over to you, Mark.
I echo what John has said. I think a very, very important aspect of data governance and what is happening with data protection for many organizations is that this is an opportunity to just look at how you're dealing with your data. You know, in many instances, we process our data in a particular way because we've always done that in the past. The rationale is legacy, rather than thinking through the new tools that we have, the new types of data that we process, the purposes for which we process data. So data protection as a component of data governance actually forces a lot of companies to look more holistically at how they're dealing with their data. And I think one of the unintended benefits, or maybe unexpected benefits of data protection, is that it usually improves data governance generally, and what we look at from a security perspective and how we classify our information, etc. What we often keep information because it's cheap to keep it. We shouldn't be keeping all of that information. So our retention is probably quite heavily impacted by looking at this carefully.
Okay.
Catherine.
What's your take? Okay. And what's your take, Catherine?
I 100% agree. I mean, most of the customers that we deal with on a daily basis, managing their data is the lifeblood of an organization, and how they make sure that that data doesn't fall into the wrong hands. If you've seen a lot of the breaches that have taken place in South Africa, it's, you know, data that's falling into the wrong hands, and then it becomes quite a nightmare to manage. So what we hope to do with the solutions that we have is to, one, make sure that organizations know where their data is and be able to secure it, and make sure that the proper data retention policies are put in place. So don't leave that onus then, like Mark was saying, you people are keeping data for maybe a really long time they don't need to. If the regulation says keep data for 5 years, then put a process in place that then deletes data after 5 years, and make sure that you, one, classifying it, ongoing classification has been done, making sure that sensitive data is encrypted inside any of these documents, and putting that process in place so that it doesn't become a manual process, because the minute it becomes manual, it won't be maintained, and then you'll find there'll be all sorts of problems that arise. So that's where we really come in as Microsoft to say, how do we make this simpler and automate the process and put the right tools in your hands so that you don't have to do all the heavy lifting on your own.
Okay. So under this law, and I want to ask this question to Mark, John, and Catherine as well, are data subjects able to, for example, request certain things under POPIA? Are you allowed to do that, Mark?
Yes, certainly. That's one of the issues with data protection. One of its rationales is the fact that people own their own data. And this is something that seems to have got lost in certainly the psyche among South Africans. Quite often we accept that somebody's processing our data and therefore we have no control over it. And what data protection law does is it hands back the control of that personal information to the data subjects. So if Microsoft are processing my information, I'm quite entitled to ask them, first of all, what information they have about me and what they're processing, and to ask for those details. And if I believe that some of that information is incorrect or dated or whatever the case might be, I may ask them to correct that data, and they would be obliged, as long as the law allows them to to actually delete that data or correct it as I've requested. Their personal information, it belongs to us, and that is the important aspect of data protection legislation.
Mm-hmm. John?
This creates a significant practical problem for organizations, because if a data subject requests access to their personal data, how do you go and find all the different data that you have on that data subject? It could be in emails, it could be on a shared drive, it could be in Word documents, it could be all over the place. And so many organizations are already struggling practically with how they will respond to a data subject.
Okay. Catherine, and what's your take on this?
So what we've also done, we've also put something in place in our solution that actually helps with that. So you'll see there's actually a data subject request. So if a new request came in, we'd click a new request, we'd put in the details of the data subject, and then what the tool actually does, it goes and actually does a search across, whether it be email, whether it be file shares, whether it be, any cloud type of storage that's in place, and that will pick up where their data subject information is actually found. So make that also a lot easier for organizations. So instead of them having to go and do all the heavy lifting once again, we actually highlight to them where is their data subject information found, and give them the exact locations where they then can take that information and go and make sure that they do the necessary to remove any of that information from their data subject. And you see, you can export this so different teams could see exactly which areas inside the organization that need to make the changes.
Okay. I mean, Mark, just as a side here, I mean, we're talking about data within an organization, right? But I'm thinking of, social media, for example, or a platform like LinkedIn that's got a lot of my personal information. I might have even spoken to a recruiter and given them personal information as well. These laws obviously apply to these kind of platforms as well, right? On how my data is being used.
They do, and I think that, obviously this is an example of how big the difficulty of processing personal data might be, and the extent to which these laws are in place. But the point is that the rationale remains, and it doesn't matter whether you're a social media company. If you are processing information, you should allow access to your data subjects to be able to see that information. And it is something that around the world we're going to start seeing, or we're already seeing, not we're going to start seeing. We're seeing a lot of queries around social media companies, how they process information, what they can do with it, etc. I mean, Facebook is a prime example
Yes.
of that case where we've discussed that already, where essentially the world has said, Facebook, you've got to clean up your act, and that is part of what Mark Zuckerberg is doing, is to ensure that we look at information with privacy in mind. Yes, Aki, so I hope that answers your question.
No, absolutely. No, I was just thinking, because the moment you start thinking about data, you just realize how much of your personal data is all over the place. It's kind of scary. It actually scares me, and this has certainly been an eye-opener for me. So, Catherine, this is an amazing tool, and when you look at this particular tool, if Compliance Manager gives me the thumbs up and I get a green score, for example, does that now mean, hey, I am compliant and I can sit back and take it easy? Does that mean that, or is this an ongoing process?
It's an ongoing process. I think there could be that thinking that, hey, once I've done all these things, I'm done. But as we've spoken about, new data is going to be produced. You're going to be constantly having to relook at this. And what we're trying to do is just make it easier for users. But at the end of the day, even if you do all these things, there's still a people and a process component that needs to be adhered to. The technology definitely supports it and helps, but there's still ongoing work that needs to be done in every organization.
Yeah, and I mean, John and Mark, I'm sure you guys are seeing this over and over. And I think you've got to re-stress this, as we said earlier. This is now going to be baked into the way you do business. You can't just, once you become compliant, say, okay, it's cool, we're done. this is ongoing. As Catherine just mentioned, there's new data coming through. There's not at any stage that you can just relax, because as soon as you relax, that's when your defenses are going to go down, and that's where you get caught, with not being compliant. And you mentioned the repercussions for that kind of breach.
Yeah, I think that just to add to what Catherine said, as she mentioned people, process, and technology, I'd just like to add an extra one there, which is know-how or awareness. And it's so important for organizations to know more about data protection, know how to use the tools, know more about what the law requires you to do. And that's so important in baking it into an organization and really embedding it in the culture of an organization. And we often say that data protection is like personal fitness. You're always trying to get fitter, but you're never 100% fit. And sometimes you're going to be less fit, and other times you're going to be fitter. So it's important to always be striving towards being as fit as you possibly can. And one of the difficult things is that things change over time. And one of the really good things that Microsoft has done with the Compliance Manager is that when the regulatory requirement or the law changes, Microsoft automatically updates the template that the assessment is based on and notifies the user. So the user can just update the templates, and you immediately then back up to date with the latest law, and you can run the assessment on just the changes. So it gives you that ability going forward into the future to be able to adapt and change based on how the law changes going into the future.
Okay, Mark, your take?
Yes, I go a little bit further than John. John is absolutely correct about the law, etc. But we also have very good standards and principles that are constantly evolving, because we know that technology is moving at such a rapid pace that the law doesn't keep up. So what is also built into the tool is, for instance, the standards. And Catherine specifically mentioned the ISO 27001 standards. Now, there are a whole host of standards that are published by the Information Standards Organization, or the International Standards Organization rather, that specifically deal with aspects of review and making sure that you are checking constantly. And the other aspect of it is just simply they are intended to be proactive. So your risk management measures are intended to be proactive, but what happens when something goes wrong? And there are also mechanisms that help you contain breaches, protect information after there might be a breach, etc. But again, organizations like Microsoft and the larger organizations are constantly assessing this threat landscape and providing tools that help us in trying to address the threat landscape. This is not just the law, it is what we do to ensure that we are dealing with compliance with the law, but also just good business, that we are doing things with cognizance of what is going on around us, and that's just good business. Thanks, Aki.
Thank you so much to Catherine De Klerk, Modern Work Specialist at Microsoft, John Giles, Mark Heyink, attorneys at Michalsons. That was very informative, and I've certainly learned a lot about POPIA and the compliance, and realized that it's not just something that you start a few weeks before. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of compliance that organizations need to go through. And as a subject of the data and how my data is being used as an outsider, I feel a little bit more confident in the processes that we've got coming up. So thanks to all of you for joining me and keeping it so interesting and insightful. I've certainly learned a lot from all of you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Aki.
Thanks for your time.